The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 1, Side 2. Doubtless the influx of Islamic ideas had something to do with the decline in the status of woman in India after Vedic days. The custom of purdah, or curtain, the seclusion of married women, came into India with the Persians and the Mohammedans, and has therefore been stronger in the north than in the south. Partly to protect their wives from the Moslems, Hindu husbands developed a system of purdah so rigid that a respectable woman could show herself only to her husband and her sons, and could move in public only under a heavy veil. Even the doctor who treated her and took her pulse had to do so through a curtain. In some circles it was a breach of good manners to inquire after a man's wife, or to speak as a guest to the ladies of the house. The custom of burning widows on their husbands' pyres was also an importation into India. Herodotus describes it as practiced by the ancient Scythians and Thracians. If we may believe him, the wives of a Thracian fought for the privilege of being slain over his grave. Probably the rite came down from the almost worldwide primitive usage of immolating one or more of the wives or concubines of a prince or rich man, along with slaves and other perquisites, to take care of him in the beyond. The Atharva Veda speaks of it as an old custom, but the Rig Veda indicates that in Vedic days it had been softened to the requirement that the widow should lie on her husband's pyre for a moment before his cremation. The Mahabharata shows the institution restored and unrepentant. It gives several examples of sati, and lays down the rule that the chaste widow does not wish to survive her husband but enters proudly into the fire. The sacrifice was effected by burning the wife in a pit, or among the Telugus in the south by burying her alive. Strabo reports that sati prevailed in India in the time of Alexander, and that the Katii, a Punjab tribe, had made sati a law in order to prevent wives from poisoning their husbands. Manu makes no mention of the practice. The Brahmins opposed it at first, then accepted it, and finally lent it a religious sanction by interpreting it as bound up with the eternity of marriage. A woman once married to a man remained his forever, and would be rejoined to him in his later lives. In Rajasthan, the absolute possession of the wife by the husband took the form of the johur, in which a Rajput, facing certain defeat, immolated his wives before advancing to his own death in battle. The usage was widespread under the Mughals, despite Moslem abhorrence, and even the powerful Akbar failed to dislodge it. On one occasion, Akbar himself tried to dissuade a Hindu bride who wished to be burned on the pyre of her dead betrothed. But though the Brahmins added their pleas to the king's, she insisted on the sacrifice. As the flames reached her, and Akbar's son Danayal continued to argue with her, she replied, "Do not annoy, do not annoy." Another widow, rejecting similar pleas, held her finger in the flame of a lamp until the finger was completely burned. Giving no sign of pain, she indicated in this way her scorn of those who advised her to refuse the rite. In Vijayanagar, sati sometimes took a wholesale form. Not one or a few, but all of the many wives of a prince or a captain followed him to death. Conti reports that the Raya, or king, had selected 3,000 of his 12,000 wives as favorites, on condition that at his death they should voluntarily burn themselves with him, which is considered to be a great honor for them. It is difficult to say how thoroughly the medieval Hindu widow was reconciled to sati by religious inculcation and belief, and the hope of reunion with her husband in another life. Sati became less and less popular as India developed contacts with Europe, but the Hindu widow continued to suffer many disabilities. Since marriage bound a woman eternally to her husband, her remarriage after his death was a mortal offense and was bound to create confusion in his later existences. The widow was therefore required by Brahmanical law to remain unmarried, to shave her head, and live out her life, if she did not prefer sati, in the care of her children and in acts of private charity. She was not left destitute. On the contrary, she had a first lien on her husband's estate for her maintenance. These rules were followed only by the orthodox women of the middle and upper classes, that is, by some 30% of the population. They were ignored by Moslems, Sikhs, and the lower castes. Hindu opinion likened this second virginity of the widow to the celibacy of nuns in Christendom. In either case, some women renounced marriage and were set aside for charitable ministrations. 4. Manners, customs, and character. Sexual modesty, hygiene, dress, appearance, the gentle art among the Hindus, faults and virtues, games, festivals, death. It will seem incredible to the provincial mind that the same people that tolerated such institutions as child marriage, temple prostitution, and sati was also preeminent in gentleness, decency, and courtesy. Aside from a few devadasis, prostitutes were rare in India, and sexual propriety was exceptionally high. It must be admitted, says the unsympathetic Dubois, that the laws of etiquette and social politeness are much more clearly laid down, and much better observed by all classes of Hindus, even by the lowest, than they are by people of corresponding social position in Europe. The leading role played by sex in Occidental conversation and wit was quite alien to Hindu manners, which forbade any public intimacy between men and women, and looked upon the physical contact of the sexes in dancing as improper and obscene. A Hindu woman might go anywhere in public without fear of molestation or insult. Indeed, the risks, as the Oriental saw the matter, was all on the other side. Manu warns men, "Woman is by nature ever inclined to tempt man. Hence a man should not sit in a secluded place even with his nearest female relative, and he must never look higher than the ankles of a passing girl." Cleanliness was literally next to godliness in India. Hygiene was not, as Anatole France thought, la seule morale, but it was made an essential part of piety. Manu laid down many centuries ago an exacting code of physical refinement. Early in the morning, one instruction reads, let him, the Brahmin, bathe, decorate his body, clean his teeth, apply collyrium to his eyes, and worship the gods. The native schools made good manners and personal cleanliness the first courses in the curriculum. Every day the caste Hindu would bathe his body and wash the simple robe he was to wear. It seemed to him abominable to use the same garment unwashed for more than a day. The Hindus, said Sir William Huber, stand out as examples of bodily cleanliness among Asiatic races, and, we may add, among the races of the world. The ablutions of the Hindu have passed into a proverb. Yuan Chuang, 1,300 years ago, described thus the eating habits of the Hindus. They are pure of themselves and not from compulsion. Before every meal they must have a wash. The fragments and remains are not served up again. The food utensils are not passed on. Those which are of pottery or of wood must be thrown away after use, and those which are of gold, silver, copper, or iron get another polishing. As soon as a meal is over, they chew the toothstick and make themselves clean. Before they have finished ablutions, they do not come in contact with each other. The Brahmin usually washed his hands, feet, and teeth before and after each meal. He ate with his fingers from food on a leaf, and thought it unclean to use twice a plate, a knife, or a fork, and when finished he rinsed his mouth 7 times. The toothbrush was always new, a twig freshly plucked from a tree. To the Hindu it seemed disreputable to brush the teeth with the hair of an animal, or to use the same brush twice. So many are the ways in which men may scorn one another. The Hindu chewed almost incessantly the leaf of the betel plant, which blackened the teeth in a manner disagreeable to Europeans and agreeable to himself. This and the occasional use of opium consoled him for his usual abstention from tobacco and intoxicating drinks. Hindu law books give explicit rules for menstrual hygiene and for meeting the demands of nature. Nothing could exceed in complexity or solemnity the ritual for Brahmin defecation. The twice-born must use only his left hand in this rite, and must cleanse the parts with water, and he considered his house defiled by the very presence of Europeans who contented themselves with paper. The outcasts, however, and many Shudras, were less particular, and might turn any roadside into a privy. In the quarters occupied by these classes, public sanitation was confined to an open sewer line in the middle of the street. In so warm a climate, clothing was a superfluity, and beggars and saints bridged the social scale in agreeing to do without it. One southern caste, like the Canadian Doukhobors, threatened to migrate if its members were compelled to wear clothing. Until the late 18th century, it was probably the custom in southern India, as still in Bali, for both sexes to go naked above the waist. Children were dressed for the most part in beads and rings. Most of the population went barefoot. If the orthodox Hindu wore shoes, they had to be of cloth, for under no circumstances would he use shoes of leather. A large number of the men contented themselves with loin-cloths. When they needed more covering, they bound some fabric about the waist and threw the loose end over the left shoulder. The Rajputs wore trousers of every color and shape, with a tunic girdled by a ceinture, a scarf at the neck, sandals or boots on the feet, and a turban on the head. The turban had come in with the Moslems and had been taken over by the Hindus, who wound it carefully around the head in varying manner according to caste, but always with the generosity of a magician unfurling endless silk. Sometimes one turban unraveled reached the length of 70 feet. The women wore a flowing robe, colorful silk sari or homespun kadar, which passed over both shoulders, clasped the waist tightly, and then fell to the feet. Often a few inches of bronze flesh were left bare below the breast. Hair was oiled to guard it against the desiccating sun. Men divided theirs in the center and threw it together into a tuft behind the left ear. Women coiled a part of theirs upon their heads, but let the rest hang free, often decorating it with flowers or covering it with a scarf. The men were handsome, the young women were beautiful, and all presented a magnificent carriage. An ordinary Hindu in a loincloth often had more dignity than a European diplomat completely equipped. Pierre Loti thought it incontestable that the beauty of the Aryan race reaches its highest development of perfection and refinement among the upper class in India. Both sexes were adept in cosmetics, and the women felt naked without jewelry. A ring in the left nostril denoted marriage. On the forehead, in most cases, was a painted symbol of religious faith. It is difficult to go below these surface appearances and describe the character of the Hindus, for every people harbors all virtues and all vices, and witnesses tend to select such of these as will point their moral and adorn their tale. I think we may take as their greatest vice, says Père Dubois, the untrustworthiness, deceit, and double-dealing which are common to all Hindus. Certain it is that there is no nation in the world which thinks so lightly of an oath or of perjury. Lying, says Westermarck, has been called the national vice of the Hindus. Hindus are wily and deceitful, says Macaulay. According to the laws of Manu and the practice of the world, a lie told for good motives is forgivable. If, for example, the death of a priest would result from speaking the truth, falsehood is justifiable. But Yuan Chuang tells us, they do not practice deceit, and they keep their sworn obligations. They will not take anything wrongfully, and they yield more than fairness requires. Abu al-Fazl, not prejudiced in favor of India, reports the Hindus of the 16th century as religious, affable, cheerful, lovers of justice, given to retirement, able in business, admirers of truth, grateful, and of unbounded fidelity. Their honesty, said honest Keir Hardie, is proverbial. They borrow and lend on word of mouth, and the repudiation of a debt is almost unknown. I have had before me, says a British judge in India, hundreds of cases in which a man's property, liberty, and life depended upon his telling a lie, and he has refused to tell it. How shall we reconcile these conflicting testimonies? Perhaps it is very simple. Some Hindus are honest, and some are not. Again, the Hindus are very cruel and gentle. The English language has derived a short and ugly word from that strange secret society, almost a caste, of tugs or thugs, which in the 18th and 19th centuries committed thousands of atrocious murders in order, they said, to offer the victims as sacrifices to the goddess Kali. Vincent Smith writes of these thugs, literally cheats, in terms not quite irrelevant to our time. The gangs had little to fear and enjoyed almost complete immunity. They always had powerful protectors. The moral feeling of the people had sunk so low that there were no signs of general reprehension of the cold-blooded crimes committed by the thugs. They were accepted as part of the established order of things, and until the secrets of the organization were given away, it was usually impossible to obtain evidence against even the most notorious thugs. Nevertheless, there is comparatively little crime in India and little violence. By universal admission, the Hindus are gentle to the point of timidity. Too worshipful and good-natured, too long broken upon the wheel of conquest and alien despotisms to be good fighters except in the sense that they can bear pain with unequaled bravery. Their greatest faults are probably listlessness and laziness, but in the Hindus these are not faults but climatic necessities and adaptations, like the dolce far niente of the Latin peoples and the economic fever of the Americans. The Hindus are sensitive, emotional, temperamental, imaginative. Therefore they are better artists and poets than rulers or executives. They can exploit their fellows with the same zest that characterizes the entrepreneur everywhere. Yet they are given to limitless charity, and are the most hospitable hosts this side of barbarism. Even their enemies admit their courtesy, and a generous Britisher sums up his long experience by ascribing to the higher classes in Calcutta polished manners, clearness and comprehensiveness of understanding, liberality of feeling, and independence of principle that would have stamped them gentlemen in any country in the world. The Hindu genius to an outsider seems somber, And doubtless the Hindus have not had much cause for laughter. The dialogues of Buddha indicate a great variety of games, including one that strangely resembles chess, but neither these nor their successors exhibit the vivacity and joyousness of Western games. Akbar, in the 16th century, introduced into India the game of polo, which had apparently come from Persia and was making its way across Tibet to China and Japan. And it pleased him to play pachisi, the modern parcheesi, on squares cut in the pavement of the palace quadrangle at Agra, with pretty slave girls as living pieces. Frequent religious festivals lent color to public life. Greatest of all was the Durga Puja, in honor of the great goddess-mother Kali. For weeks before its approach, the Hindus feasted and sang, but the culminating ceremonial was a procession in which every family carried an image of the goddess to the Ganges, flung it into the river, and returned homeward with all merriness spent. The Holi festival, celebrated in honor of the goddess Vasanti, took on a Saturnalian character. Phallic emblems were carried in parade and were made to simulate the motions of coitus. In Chotanagpur, the harvest was the signal for general license. Men set aside all conventions, women all modesty, and complete liberty was given to the girls. The Parganite, a caste of peasants in the Raj Mahal hills, held an annual agricultural festival in which the unmarried were allowed to indulge freely in promiscuous relations. Doubtless we have here again relics of vegetation magic, intended to promote the fertility of families and the fields. More decorous were the wedding festivals that marked the great event in the life of every Hindu. Many a father brought himself to ruin in providing a sumptuous feast for the marriage of his daughter or his son. At the other end of life was the final ceremony, cremation. In Buddha's days, the Zoroastrian exposure of the corpse to birds of prey was the usual mode of departure, but persons of distinction were burned after death on a pyre, and their ashes were buried under a tope or stupa, that is, a memorial shrine. In later days, cremation became the privilege of every man. Each night one might see faggots being brought together for the burning of the dead. In Yuan Chuang's time it was not unusual for the very old to take death by the forelock and have themselves rowed by their children to the middle of the Ganges, where they threw themselves into the saving stream. Suicide, under certain conditions, has always found more approval in the East than in the West. It was permitted under the laws of Akbar to the old or the incurably diseased, and to those who wished to offer themselves as sacrifices to the gods. Thousands of Hindus have made their last oblation by starving themselves to death, or burying themselves in snow, or covering themselves with cow dung and setting it on fire, or allowing crocodiles to devour them at the mouths of the Ganges. Among the Brahmins, a form of harakiri arose, by which suicide was committed to avenge an injury or point a wrong. When one of the Rajput kings levied a subsidy upon the priestly caste, several of the wealthiest Brahmins stabbed themselves to death in his presence, laying upon him the supposedly most terrible and effective curse of all, that of a dying priest. The Brahmanical law books required that he who had resolved to die by his own hand should fast for 3 days, and that he who attempted suicide and failed should perform the severest penances. Life is a stage with one entrance, but many exits. Chapter 18. The Paradise of the Gods. In no other country is religion so powerful or so important as in India. If the Hindus have permitted alien governments to be set over them again and again, it is partly because they did not care much who ruled or exploited them, natives or foreigners. The crucial matter was religion, not politics, the soul, not the body, endless later lives rather than this passing one. When Ashoka became a saint and Akbar almost adopted Hinduism, the power of religion was revealed over even the strongest men. In our century it is a saint rather than a statesman who, for the first time in history, has unified all India. 1. The later history of Buddhism, the zenith of Buddhism, the two vehicles, Mahayana, Buddhism, Stoicism, and Christianity, the decay of Buddhism, its migrations, Ceylon, Burma, Turkestan, Tibet, Cambodia, China, Japan. 200 years after Ashoka's death, Buddhism reached the peak of its curve in India. The period of Buddhist growth from Ashoka to Harsha was in many ways the climax of Indian religion, education, and art. But the Buddhism that prevailed was not that of Buddha. We might better describe it as that of his rebellious disciple Subhada, who, on hearing of the master's death, said to the monks, "Enough, sirs, weep not, neither lament. We are well rid of the great Samana. We used to be annoyed by being told, 'This beseems you, this beseems you not.' But now we shall be able to do whatever we like, and what we do not like, that we shall not have to do." The first thing they did with their freedom was to split into sects. Within 2 centuries of Buddha's death, 18 varieties of Buddhistic doctrine had divided the master's heritage. The Buddhists of South India and Ceylon held fast for a time to the simpler and purer creed of the founder, which came to be called Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle. They worshipped Buddha as a great teacher, but not as a god, and their scriptures were the Pali texts of the more ancient faith. But throughout northern India, Tibet, Mongolia, China, and Japan, the Buddhism that prevailed was the Mahayana, or the greater vehicle, defined and propagated by Kanishka's council. These politically inspired theologians announced the divinity of Buddha, surrounded him with angels and saints, adopted the yoga asceticism of Patanjali, and issued in Sanskrit a new set of holy writ which, though it lent itself readily to metaphysical and scholastic refinements, proclaimed and certified a more popular religion than the austere pessimism of Shakyamuni. The Mahayana was Buddhism softened with Brahmanical deities, practices, and myths, and adapted to the needs of the Kushan Tatars and the Mongols of Tibet, over whom Kanishka had extended his rule. A heaven was conceived in which there were many Buddhas, of whom Amida Buddha, the Redeemer, came to be the best beloved by the people. This heaven and a corresponding hell were to be the reward or punishment of good or evil done on earth, and would thereby liberate some of the king's militia for other services. The greatest of the saints in this new theology were the Bodhisattvas, or future Buddhas, who voluntarily refrained from achieving the nirvana, here freedom from rebirth, that was within their merit and power, in order to be reborn into life after life, and to help others on earth to find the way. As in Mediterranean Christianity, these saints became so popular that they almost crowded out the head of the pantheon in worship and art. The veneration of relics, the use of holy water, candles, incense, the rosary, clerical vestments, a liturgical dead language, monks and nuns, monastic tonsure and celibacy, confession, fast days, the canonization of saints, purgatory, and masses for the dead flourished in Buddhism as in medieval Christianity, and seem to have appeared in Buddhism first. Mahayana became to Hinayana, or primitive Buddhism, what Catholicism was to Stoicism and primitive Christianity. Buddha, like Luther, had made the mistake of supposing that the drama of religious ritual could be replaced with sermons and morality, and the victory of a Buddhism rich in myths, miracles, ceremonies, and intermediating saints corresponds to the ancient and current triumph of a colorful and dramatic Catholicism over the austere simplicity of early Christianity and modern Protestantism. That same popular preference for polytheism, miracles, and myths which destroyed Buddha's Buddhism finally destroyed in India the Buddhism of the greater vehicle itself. For, to speak with the hindsight wisdom of the historian, if Buddhism was to take over so much of Hinduism, so many of its legends, its rites, and its gods, soon very little would remain to distinguish the two religions, and the one with the deeper roots, the more popular appeal, and the richer economic resources and political support would gradually absorb the other. Rapidly, superstition, which seems to be the very lifeblood of our race, poured over from the older faith to the younger one, until even the phallic enthusiasms of the Shakti sects found place in the ritual of Buddhism. Slowly, the patient and tenacious Brahmins recaptured influence and imperial patronage, and the success of the youthful philosopher Shankara in restoring the authority of the Vedas as the basis of Hindu thought put an end to the intellectual leadership of the Buddhists in India. The final blow came from without, and was in a sense invited by Buddhism itself. The prestige of the Sangha, or Buddhist order, had, after Ashoka, drawn the best blood of Magadha into a celibate and pacific clergy. Even in Buddha's time, some patriots had complained that the monk Gautama causes fathers to beget no sons, and families to become extinct. The growth of Buddhism and monasticism in the first year of our era sapped the manhood of India, and conspired with political division to leave India open to easy conquest. When the Arabs came, pledged to spread a simple and stoic monotheism, they looked with scorn upon the lazy, venal, miracle-mongering Buddhist monks. They smashed the monasteries, killed thousands of monks and made monasticism unpopular with the cautious. The survivors were reabsorbed into the Hinduism that had begotten them. The ancient orthodoxy received the penitent heresy, and Brahmanism killed Buddhism by a fraternal embrace. Brahmanism had always been tolerant. In all the history of the rise and fall of Buddhism and 100 other sects, we find much disputation, but no instance of persecution. On the contrary, Brahmanism eased the return of the prodigal by proclaiming Buddha a god, as an avatar of Vishnu, ending animal sacrifice and accepting into orthodox practice the Buddhist doctrine of the sanctity of all animal life. Quietly and peacefully, after 50 years of gradual decay, Buddhism disappeared from India. Meanwhile, it was winning nearly all of the remainder of the Asiatic world. Its ideas, its literature and its art spread to Ceylon and the Malay Peninsula in the south, to Tibet and Turkestan in the north, to Burma, Siam, Cambodia, China, Korea, and Japan in the east. In this way, all of these regions except the Far East received as much civilization as they could digest, precisely as Western Europe and Russia received civilization from Roman and Byzantine monks in the Middle Ages. The cultural zenith of most of these nations came from the stimulus of Buddhism. From the time of Ashoka to its decay in the 9th century, Anuradhapura in Ceylon was one of the major cities of the Oriental world. The Bo tree there has been worshipped for 2,000 years, and the temple on the heights of Kandy is one of the Meccas of the 150 million Buddhists of Asia. The Buddhism of Burma is probably the purest now extant, and its monks often approach the ideal of Buddha. Under their ministrations, the 13 million inhabitants of Burma have reached a standard of living considerably higher than that of India. Sven Hedden, Aurel Stein, and Pelliot have unearthed from the sands of Turkestan hundreds of Buddhist manuscripts and other evidences of a culture which flourished there from the time of Kanishka to the 13th century A.D. In the 7th century of our era, the enlightened warrior Srongtsan Gampo established an able government in Tibet, annexed Nepal, built Lhasa as his capital, and made it rich as a halfway house in Chinese-Indian trade. Having invited Buddhist monks to come from India and spread Buddhism and education among his people, he retired from rule for 4 years in order to learn how to read and write, and inaugurated the Golden Age of Tibet. Thousands of monasteries were built in the mountains and on the Great Plateau, and a voluminous Tibetan canon of Buddhist books was published in 333 volumes, which preserved for modern scholarship many works whose Hindu originals have long been lost. Here, hermetically sealed from the rest of the world, Buddhism developed into a maze of superstitions, monasticism, and ecclesiasticism rivaled only by early medieval Europe, and the Dalai Lama, or all-embracing priest, hidden away in the great Potala monastery that overlooks the city of Lhasa, is still believed by the good people of Tibet to be the living incarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. In Cambodia, or Indochina, Buddhism conspired with Hinduism to provide the religious framework for one of the richest ages in the history of Oriental art. Buddhism, like Christianity, won its greatest triumphs outside the land of its birth, and it won them without shedding a drop of blood. 2. The new divinities: Hinduism, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Krishna, Kali, animal gods, the sacred cow, polytheism, and monotheism. The Hinduism that now replaced Buddhism was not one religion, nor was it only religion. It was a medley of faiths and ceremonies whose practitioners had only 4 qualities in common. They recognized the caste system and the leadership of the Brahmins. They reverenced the cow as especially representative of divinity. They accepted the law of karma and the transmigration of souls, and they replaced with new gods the deities of the Vedas. These faiths had in part antedated and survived Vedic nature worship. In part they had grown from the connivance of the Brahmins at rites, divinities, and beliefs unknown to the scriptures and largely contrary to the Vedic spirit. They had boiled in the cauldron of Hindu religious thought even while Buddhism maintained a passing intellectual ascendancy. The gods of Hinduism were characterized by a kind of anatomical superabundance, vaguely symbolizing extraordinary knowledge, activity, or power. The new Brahma had 4 faces, Kartikeya 6, Shiva had 3 eyes, Indra 1,000, and nearly every deity had 4 arms. At the head of this revised pantheon was Brahma, chivalrously neuter, acknowledged master of the gods, but no more noticed in actual worship than a constitutional monarch in modern Europe. Combined with him and Shiva in a triad, not a trinity, of dominant deities was Vishnu, a god of love who repeatedly became man in order to help mankind. His greatest incarnation was Krishna. As such, he was born in a prison, had accomplished many marvels of heroism and romance, healed the deaf and the blind, helped lepers, championed the poor, and raised men from the grave. He had a beloved disciple, Arjuna, before whom he was transfigured. He died, some say, by an arrow, others say by a crucifixion on a tree. He descended into hell, rose to heaven, and will return on the last day to judge the quick and the dead. To the Hindu there are three chief processes in life and the universe: creation, preservation, and destruction. Hence divinity takes for him three main forms: Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer. These are the Trimurti, or three shapes, which all Hindus but the Jains adore. Popular devotion is divided between Vaishnavism, the religion of Vishnu, and Shivaism, the religion of Shiva. The two cults are peaceful neighbors and sometimes hold sacrifices in the same temple, and the wise Brahmins, followed by a majority of the people, pay equal honor to both these gods. Pious Vaishnavites paint upon their foreheads every morning with red clay the trident sign of Vishnu. Pious Shivaites trace horizontal lines across their brows with cow dung ashes, or wear the linga, symbol of the male organ, fastened on their arms or hung from their necks. The worship of Shiva is one of the oldest, most profound, and most terrible elements in Hinduism. Sir John Marshall reports unmistakable evidence of the cult of Shiva at Mohenjo-daro, partly in the form of a three-headed Shiva, partly in the form of little stone columns, which he presumes to be as phallic as their modern counterparts. Shivaism, he concludes, is therefore the most ancient living faith in the world. The name of the god is a euphemism. Literally it means propitious, whereas Shiva himself is viewed chiefly as a god of cruelty and destruction, the personification of that cosmic force which destroys one after another all the forms that reality takes, all cells, all organisms, all species, all ideas, all works, all planets, and all things. Never has another people dared to face the impermanence of forms and the impartiality of nature so frankly, or to recognize so clearly that evil balances good, that destruction goes step by step with creation, and that all birth is a capital crime, punishable with death. The Hindu, tortured with 1,000 misfortunes and sufferings, sees in them the handiwork of a vivacious force that appears to find pleasure in breaking down everything that Brahma, the creative power in nature, has produced. Shiva dances to the tune of a perpetually forming, dissolving, and reforming world. Just as death is the penalty of birth, so birth is the frustration of death, and the same God who symbolizes destruction represents also, for the Hindu mind, that passion and torrent of reproduction which overrides the death of the individual with the continuance of the race. In some parts of India, particularly Bengal, this creative or reproductive energy, Shakti, of Shiva or nature, is personified in the figure of Shiva's wife, Kali, Parvati, Uma, Durga, and is worshipped in one of the many Shakti cults. Until the last century, this worship was a bloody ritual, often involving human sacrifice. Latterly, the goddess has been content with goats. The deity is portrayed for the populace by a black figure with gaping mouth and protruding tongue, adorned with snakes and dancing upon a corpse. Her earrings are dead men, her necklace is a string of skulls, her face and breasts are smeared with blood. 2 of her 4 hands carry a sword and a severed head. The other 2 are extended in blessing and protection. For Kali Parvati is the goddess of motherhood as well as the bride of destruction and death. She can be tender as well as cruel, and can smile as well as kill. Once, perhaps, she was a mother goddess in Sumeria, and was imported into India before she became so terrible. Doubtless she and her lord are made as horrible as possible in order that timid worshippers may be frightened into decency, and perhaps into generosity to the priests. The priests of Shivaism, however, are seldom Brahmins, and the majority of the Brahmins look with scorn and regret upon the Shakti cult. These are the greater gods of Hinduism, but they are merely 5 of 30 million deities in the Hindu pantheon. Only to catalogue them would take 100 volumes. Some of them are more properly angels, some are what we should call devils, Some are heavenly bodies, like the sun. Some are mascots, like Lakshmi, the goddess of good luck. Many of them are beasts of the field or fowl of the air. To the Hindu mind, there is no real gap between animals and men. Animals as well as men had souls, and souls were perpetually passing from men into animals and back again. All these species were woven into one infinite web of karma and reincarnation. The elephant, for example, became the god Ganesha, and was recognized as Shiva's son. He personified man's animal nature, and at the same time his image served as a charm against evil fortune. Monkeys and snakes were terrible and therefore divine. The cobra, or naga, whose bite causes almost immediate death, received a special veneration. Annually, the people of many parts of India celebrated a religious feast in honor of snakes, and made offerings of milk and plantains to the cobras at the entrance to their holes. Temples have been erected in honor of snakes, as in eastern Mysore. Great numbers of reptiles take up their residence in these buildings, and are fed and cared for by the priests. Crocodiles, tigers, peacocks, parrots, even rats receive their meed of worship. Most sacred of all animals to a Hindu is the cow. Images of bulls in every material and size appear in temples and homes, and in the city squares. The cow itself is the most popular organism in India and has full freedom of the streets. Its dung is used as fuel or a holy ointment. Its urine is a sacred wine that will wash away all inner or outer uncleanness. Under no circumstances are these animals to be eaten by a Hindu, nor is their flesh to be worn as clothing, headgear or gloves or shoes. And when they die, they are to be buried with the pomp of religious ritual. Perhaps wise statesmanship once decreed this taboo in order to preserve agricultural draft animals for the growing population of India. Today, however, they number almost 1/4 as many as the population. The Hindu view is that it is no more unreasonable to feel a profound affection for cows and a profound revulsion at the thought of eating them than it is to have similar feelings in regard to domestic cats and dogs. The cynical view of the matter is that the Brahmins believed that cows should never be slaughtered, that insects should never be injured, and that widows should be burned alive. The truth is that the worship of animals occurs in the history of every people, and that if one must deify any animal, the kind and placid cow seems entitled to her measure of devotion. We must not be too haughtily shocked by the menagerie of Hindu gods. We, too, have had our serpent devil of Eden, our golden calf of the Old Testament, our sacred fish of the catacombs, and our gracious Lamb of God. The secret of polytheism is the inability of the simple mind to think in impersonal terms. It can understand persons more readily than forces, wills more easily than laws. The Hindu suspects that our human senses see only the outside of the events that they report. Behind the veil of these phenomena, he thinks there are countless superphysical beings whom, in Kant's phrase, we can only conceive but never perceive. A certain philosophical tolerance in the Brahmins has added to the teeming pantheon of India. Local or tribal gods have been received into the Hindu Valhalla by adoption, usually by interpreting them as aspects or avatars of accepted deities. Every faith could get its credentials if it paid its dues. In the end, nearly every god became a phase, attribute, or incarnation of another god, until all these divinities, to adult Hindu minds, merged into one. Polytheism became pantheism, almost monotheism, almost monism. Just as a good Christian may pray to the Madonna or one of 1,000 saints and yet be a monotheist in the sense that he recognizes one God as supreme, so the Hindu prays to Kali or Rama or Krishna or Ganesha without presuming for a moment that these are supreme deities. Some Hindus recognize Vishnu as supreme, some call Shiva merely a subordinate divinity. Some call Shiva supreme and make Vishnu an angel. If only a few worship Brahma, it is because of its impersonality, its intangibility, its distance, and for the same reason that most churches in Christendom were erected to Mary or a saint, while Christianity waited for Voltaire to raise a chapel to God. 3. Beliefs. The Puranas, the reincarnations of the universe, the migrations of the soul, karma, its philosophical aspects, life as evil, release. Mingled with this complex theology is a complex mythology, at once superstitious and profound. The Vedas having died in the language in which they were written, and the metaphysics of the Brahmin schools being beyond the comprehension of the people, Vyasa and others, over a period of 1,000 years, 500 BC to 500 AD, composed 18 Puranas, old stories, in 400,000 couplets, expounding to the laity the exact truth about the creation of the world, its periodical evolution and dissolution, the genealogy of the gods, and the history of the heroic age. These books made no pretense to literary form, logical order, or numerical moderation. They insisted that the lovers Urvashi and Pururavas spent 61,000 years in pleasure and delight. But through the intelligibility of their language, the attractiveness of their parables, and the orthodoxy of their doctrine, they became the second Bible of Hinduism, the grand repository of its superstitions, its myths, even of its philosophy. Here, for example, in the Vishnu Purana, is the oldest and ever-recurrent theme of Hindu thought, that individual separateness is an illusion, and that all life is one. After 1,000 years came Ribu to Nidaga's city to impart further knowledge to him. He saw him outside the city, just as the king was about to enter with a great train of attendants, standing afar and holding himself apart from the crowd, his neck wizened with fasting, returning from the wood with fuel and grass. When Ribu saw him, he went to him and greeted him and said, "O Brahman, why standest thou here alone?" Nidaga said, "Behold the crowd pressing about the king who is just entering the city. That is why I stand alone." Ribu said, "Which of these is the king, and who are the others? Tell me that, for thou seemest informed." Nidaga said, "He who rides upon the fiery elephant, towering like a mountain peak, that is the king. The others are his attendants." Ribu said, "These two, the king and the elephant, are pointed out by you without being separated by mark of distinction. Give me the mark of distinction between them. I would know which is here the elephant and which the king." Nidaga said, "The elephant is below, the king is above him. Who does not know the relationship of born to bearer?" Ribu said, "That I may know, teach me. What is that which is indicated by the word below, and what is above?" Straight Nidaga sprang upon the Guru, and said to him, "Hear now, I will tell thee what thou demandest of me. I am above like the king, you are below like the elephant. For thy instruction I give thee this example." Ribu said, "If you are in the position of the king, and I in that of the elephant, so tell me this still. Which of us is you, and which is I?" Then swiftly Nidaga, falling down before him, clasped his feet and spake, "Truly thou art Ribu, my master. By this I know that thou, my Guru, art come." Ribu said, "Yes, to give thee teaching. Because of thy former willingness to serve me, I, Ribu, by name, am come to thee. And what I have just taught thee, in short, heart of highest truth, that is complete non-duality." When he had thus spoken to Nidaga, the Guru Ribu departed thence. But forthwith Nidaga, taught by this symbolic teaching, turned his mind completely to non-duality. All beings from thenceforth he saw not distinct from himself, and so he saw Brahman, and thus he achieved the highest salvation. In these Puranas and kindred writings of medieval India, we find a very modern theory of the universe. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.